The Utopian Seed Project presents Southeast Seed. Lots of thanks to this episode's presenting sponsor, 2 Seeds in a Pod.
Whoa. I think for all Georgians, we really need to be embracing this. This is a squash from Georgia.
Today, we're going to talk about squash. The many squash species that we eat are all native to the Americas and come from the genus Cucurbita. Cucurbita pepo gives us pumpkins and summer squash and acorn squash, and Cucurbita machata gives us butternuts. Cucurbita agyrosperma gives us cusha squash, and Cucurbita maxima, the candy roasters. This incredible diversity of edible squash species is often a boon for seed savers who can take on several squash seed contracts from multiple species without being too concerned that the different varieties will cross-pollinate. See, squash have these separate male and female flowers, these big, beautiful orange things, and they're pollinated by bees, which can often travel for miles to get from plant to plant, which means that squash isolation distances can be quite large if you're growing 2 varieties of the same species at the same time in the same field. But those big, beautiful flowers are also really easy to hand-pollinate, so squash can be a great group to begin practicing breeding techniques with.
Every seed saver is a plant breeder, actually. Look at this genetic material here.
That was Mehmet Öztan, who runs a small seed company called 2 Seeds in a Pod. Mehmet hand-pollinates his squash because he's growing several varieties of the same species close together.
I'm using organza bags. You can find them easily online. Or they may be called jewelry bags, to cover the male and female.
You found a good female flower?
Yes, looks beautiful. So that I can hand pollinate them the next day, but the reason I am covering them now is because they are going to bloom. There's still probably 3 more days for that one.
3 more days for that tiny fruit to
3,
have
4.
the flower open?
Yeah. The way I can tell that they're gonna bloom is the color. They get this intense, almost like sunset color. The petals do, and then they get really big, and especially the male flowers stretch, and then they get very pronounced. These bags are nylon, although they breathe. I don't want to choke the flowers when it's too hot.
You don't want to choke the fruit.
Early in the morning I'm gonna come out, open the bags, and take the male flowers. That's the male flower
That you picked?
Yep. And these are the flowers that I bagged last evening.
They're open now.
Now they are open. They bloomed. Open the bags and take the male flowers, and then use the pollens on stigma to hand pollinate the female flowers. And now I'm going to hand pollinate this fruit. Oh, it's lots of pollens. And then after using the male flower, I bag the female flower again, to just make sure that between that time and later, until the sunset next day, the bees don't have another chance to basically cross-pollinate the flowers. I'll mark the fruit. I'll use a zip tie to mark the fruits that I hand-pollinated, so that I know which fruit I hand-pollinated. The flowers drop, right, eventually. I want to make sure that I know this fruit was hand-pollinated, so I mark it with a red zip tie. And done. And I always keep a hand sanitizer with myself in my pocket, because there's other varieties, other summer squash varieties in the field. So in between hand-pollinating different varieties, I sanitize my hands, making sure that pollens are not left on my fingertips.
Hand sanitizer can be a valuable tool if you want to save seeds from multiple varieties of the same species to ensure they don't cross. If you don't keep those lineages isolated, you can end up with some novel hybrids.
There are so many varieties of squash that you have got to be careful so as not to really cross them too much. I have planted my tropical pumpkin And I planted butternut squash, and they have cross-pollinated. And I got a bunch of a variety of things that I had no idea. While they were all out there in the garden, all the squash came looking like my pumpkin. But funny enough, not all of the fruit took the same pollination. Some bear what they're supposed to look like. The only way that I'm gonna get those pumpkins back is to go visiting Florida or down to the islands where they kept the variety.
So, just like Hyleen experienced, when an accidental cross happens, it won't affect the squash in the field, just the seeds that you save from those squash. You won't see the effects of the cross until you grow out those seeds the following year. This is why it's so important to keep your varieties isolated so that they don't accidentally cross. But at the same time, farmers can design planned crosses to preserve older varieties and incorporate locally adaptive traits.
This is the F2 Nanticoke Yami cross, and it's got serious diversity. The parent squash of this was a Bolivian squash that looked a lot like this. This was one of the parents, and then it was open pollinated. We got one fruit 7 years ago, and then when I planted the seeds from that one fruit last year, what we got were a whole bunch of squash that looked like this. A pink striped thing, and I recognize that that is there's no doubt that that came from a Nanticoke cross. So I figured save it and see what happens in the F2. The advantage of the Nanticoke is that it's a maxima that is resistant to vine borer, because it puts down big roots at every node, so the vine borer can't mess it up. Sometimes the vine borer makes it all the way to the fruit and maybe gets a 1/4 inch into the fruit and then dies, or it can't go any further because the fruit's too thick for it to bite through. So a maxima for the southeast and the mid-Atlantic, where we have big problems with vine borer, is the main goal of this breeding project. But I would like to stabilize something akin to that one, or look at this beauty here, like a big beautiful pink striped squash. That's the goal. This is the F3. The seeds in here are F3 seeds. So we'll see what happens with them.
Let's unpack some of the vocabulary in that last clip, shall we? Nate was referring to filial generations, F1, F2, F3.
This is the F2 Nanticoke Yami cross.
The letter F for filial comes from the Latin filia, meaning daughter, and it's used by breeders to keep track of plant generations, specifically to keep track of hybrid generations where the parents come from different lineages, and so we can't always expect F1 to resemble the parents, nor can we expect F2 to resemble F1. Hybrid lineages don't breed true, in contrast to open-pollinated lineages where we can usually expect the parents to resemble their children.
If you want to be a seed saver, you need to have open-pollinated seeds. That is, seeds that come from a population of seeds, or a group of seeds that if you plant this, what you're going to get is going to be more or less what you saw before in the last generation. Hybrids need to be redone, the cross, each year, and so it makes it easier to have, if you keep your parent lines a secret, a proprietary interest, and you have a good excuse for why you can charge more for it.
So, breeders can produce hybrids that combine novel traits to produce more productive squash, but there are some downsides to this. Because of their very specific genetic makeup, seeds from a hybrid plant will not produce plants that resemble it, just like the hybrid itself doesn't 100% resemble either of its parents. F1 and F2 and F3 are all unique. This makes seed saving difficult and can end up concentrating power in the small number of companies that maintain the parent lines to popular hybrid varieties. That's why seed savers like Nate often try to stabilize the hybrids that they make so that the genetic advantages of the hybrid lineage can be reliably saved in an open-pollinated form.
The challenge that I find with seed saving is that most of our seeds are hybridized. They are hybrid seeds. You can save hybrid seeds, but you got to take it through a process based upon my experience. You got to take the best of the seed that you save the first year and save it again the second year. And then take the best of the seeds that you save the second year and save it the third year. And by the time you get to the fourth year, you're almost at a stage where that seed is now reproducing true to form.
If somebody else has a hybrid and you don't know what the parents are, then you can't save that seed, and the variety could be discontinued, and then you would be out of luck. If we have our own open-pollinated varieties, we can save the seed. The other reason is that I think we could select them even better by doing it this way, because we're in the region where, we can select them better for our region. That's what I mean.
Selecting the best for the next generation is the core practice of a seed saver. Stabilizing and dehybridizing hybrid lineages requires very careful selection, but even open-pollinated varieties require farmers to select the best of each generation if the variety is to be maintained.
I always save seeds so I do it from a raw perspective, right? So I'll eat it raw, I'll check flavor on it, compare notes, also I'll check it roasted. Sometimes the flavor is more concentrated when you actually roast them. They might be a little bit more sweeter, but I'm actually looking for sweetness up front in the beginning, so that way I can taste it more like melony, cantaloupe-ish type flavor that I'm looking for, and that's the varieties that I'm really going to be kind of settling on.
When we are choosing seed to save, we look for number one, shelf life. So we don't even try to save seed from the early squash that we cut for market. So that's how we save seed. We butcher the squash for market because nobody wants to buy a big squash. And then if we come across one that's really nice, we'll save the seed. But we don't even start that process until just a few weeks ago, because we want to try to make sure that what we are selecting has got as good a shelf life as possible. So rind color and texture kind of helps us with that. So we're cutting for market, and if it's late in the season, there's no rind rot, and the color on the skin is either buff or mottled, and we open it up and it's deep orange and just has a really nice pumpkin-y perfume, then we'll save the seeds. But if it doesn't have a good rind color, if we see, even on a nice one, if we see little splotches of rot developing, if the skin tone is not right or the flesh tone's not right, then we skip it. If I cut 12 to 15 squash for market, I'll probably cull 2 and not even sell the flesh. And then maybe out of the 10 to 12 left, maybe one will make, like we'll go, okay, I'll save seed from this one. Because they're so big, we never, except to restaurants, ever sell whole squash. It's rare. We'll bring a couple to the farmer's market. Once in a while somebody really wants a whole big squash, but most of the time they want the pieces. So in the process of preparing the squash for the market, we're able to do all of our seed saving protocol. We're able to look at each individual squash and say, no, that's no good, no, that's no good, no, that's good. Okay, this one looks pretty good. And so that, to me, they actually dovetail really nicely that way.
Saving squash seed can often fit in quite well with an existing market operation. For some varieties, particularly summer squash, the fruit does need to be left on the vine past the point of maturity, but for winter squash, the seed matures when the squash is ripe, so you can save your seeds as you're selling your fruits. And if this is done over several years, farmers can produce new varieties that are specifically adapted to their local climate and market needs. Like, let's hear from Megan Allen, who hybridized 2 varieties of squash to produce a butternut that was specifically adapted to southeastern diseases, and then spent the next several years stabilizing the lineage to produce a new open-pollinated variety.
So we were looking for a butternut that was downy mildew resistant, bacterial wilt resistant, heat resistant, drought resistant, and that would produce squash bigger than like that big. We could not grow butternut squash here, basically. Yeah, crossed San Jose and Waltham. So then we spent the next many years hand-pollinating squash. So we were literally like taping all the males and taping all the females every single day for 3 or 4 weeks during the season.
How many plants did you have?
A lot. 200.
200 plants. How many hours did it take you every day?
a couple hours every morning. And I had to do it really early because before the flowers would have been up. And I did this through 2 pregnancies and, 2 like breastfeeding children and walking through the fields, and yeah. So it was a labor of love. Yeah. But you could tell it was working. So like after the first cross, the females were all different shapes and sizes. Mm-hmm. They were really, really incredibly healthy plants, and they were bigger plants, and like they were still alive in August, and they were, they made all these beautiful, good tasting squash. So it was hard not to keep going. And I didn't start this even thinking like that I would be here, in 5 years with a squash and be like, oh, this is the squash. Like it became sort of this thing of like, we want the CSA to have winter squash and we want to have winter squash, and we're just gonna keep going with this, and never knowing if we would actually even be able to like hone in on necessarily a certain like squash that we called a butternut. But as we kept hand-pollinating and choosing, we kept getting closer and closer to a butternut squash. Our CSA members did taste tests for 5 years. So
Thank you, CSA members.
Yeah, right. So it's not just like I really like the way it tastes. Like, yeah, it's been, multiple people. Yeah, probably over the course, probably 80 different families have like eaten it and given their opinion on it. So, yeah.
How did you do that? Did you like give them 2 different squashes and have them compare them?
So we would have potlucks, and we'd put a whole bunch of squash out, and we would like, they'd be labeled, and we'd have the seeds, saved back for each of those, and then, they'd give them 1 to 10 ratings, and there'd be some debate. Uh-huh. This is pretty much like what we've ended up with. I would like to spend next year doing like some really detailed work on it and see if I can get it even more like narrowed to a variety. That project is like kind of coming to a close, I guess. Like maybe after next year, maybe I'm done with, I don't know if I can ever say I'm done with something, but yeah, it'll be fairly finished.
Selecting the best seed to save is an ongoing process that has to take place year after year, and it often works best when many people in a community provide input.
Thank you, CSA members.
Yeah.
But the act of saving seed itself is very simple. Anyone can do it.
Look at this beautiful thing.
Yeah.
This is so much easier when it's all mushy like that. You just hollow that out. And I just grew up doing this. Like, it's a little bit more of a relationship with the plant as opposed to formal training. And it's kind of cultivated over years by watching my grandmother do it. Then it's very easy to get them separated from all the yuck. So I have a series of strainers that I use, and it's super low tech. It's very accessible, and anybody can do this. Children can do this. These beautiful guys don't even need anything other than a household colander.
The water, the shaker.
We've got a whole bunch of different of these bad boys in different sizes of screens, and they're like $2. So I like to just use regular stuff instead of like fancy expensive seed screens.
A colander and some water work great if you're saving seeds from just a few squash. If you're operating at a slightly larger scale, a shop vac will do.
Okay, these squash need to get processed pretty soon. This is about 1,500 pounds worth of squash in here. It's about 2 bins. And
wow.
Yeah, that's like hopefully 20 pounds of seed.
20 pounds of seed and some pulp.
Yeah.
Nice pulp. Can I stick my hands in it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna stick my hands in it. Yes. Yes. Oh god, it's disgusting. It's good.
The thing about vacuuming is, like, yeah, you could just scoop it, but then you get a whole lot more extra pulp in with the seeds, and it's harder to clean out all that pulp. So if you vacuum it, you get all the seeds, but a lot less pulp at first. Makes it easier to clean. You can really accomplish the same thing as a vacuum, just like using your fingers, because it leaves a lot of the pulp in the seed cavity, but after you do about 20 of them, it starts to cut under your fingernails, so you can't really do much of that.
There are a bunch of different ways to process and filter away squash pulp. It can be done with just water, but some farmers opt to ferment the seed pulp mixture first to make it easier to clean.
With fermentation, we put it into a container, and that's it? We just put it in the container?
So with most fermentation, you put it in the container, and that's it. You don't add water. But with squash, you need to add a little bit of water if you're going to ferment it. The only reason to ferment squash is you're just helping break down some of the pulp. You really want to come and stir it once or twice a day, depending on the temperature, to keep it from getting moldy. Like stuff that's sticking to the seed. Fermentation would actually make it so the pulp isn't sticking to the seed like that. You don't have to ferment squash, but it can kind of break down the pulp and make it softer, make it a little easier to deal with. You can see this is a
Like you can compare to the Seminole.
This is a Seminole pumpkin, and like there's a lot of pulp here, but the pulp is not, for the most part, actively like stuck onto the seeds.
Right.
Pour it on the screen. You might manually remove some of the bigger pieces of pulp. So a lot of the pulp either gets caught up in the screen or it falls through the screen.
So now you have nice clean seed.
When you save seed from squash that you grew yourself and plant it in the same land the following year and grow it using the same practices, you give the lineage a chance to adapt to its local environment. This makes better food.
The more you grow and save seed in your particular climate, the more those plants will become okay with your climate.
You can't have a local food program unless your seeds are local. You know, so it's like everyone talks about, you know, local food. Well, if your seeds are not regionalized to your area, then it's not a true local food program.
Farming is a challenging business. Standards for productivity and vegetable quality can be quite high. In modern agriculture, we tend to think about external inputs like fertilizer or pesticides as our primary tools for ensuring that we get the yields that we need. But the act of seed saving itself can be incredibly effective, especially for small growers.
So basically, you know, for a CSA, we need things to produce at a fairly predictable high level, right? Like we need to know that like what we plant is going to produce enough food for a certain amount of people. And in the Southeast, I feel like that is harder because there are very few people breeding vegetables and fruit for our region. And so we have sort of, over the past 13 years, trialed pretty much everything on the market from open-pollinated new varieties to heirlooms to hybrids, you know, like anything just to see like what'll do what we need it to do. Hybrid is always our like least, not what we want to choose. That's sort of our, we will only grow a hybrid because we can't get anything else to do what we need it to do.
Yeah, so like
philosophically we don't want to grow hybrids.
You're not aligned with hybrids, but sometimes hybrids do the only thing that you want in this area for the market you have.
Yes. Dehybridizing is our attempt to sort of capture the productiveness or disease resistance or whatever the case may be of the advantage that hybrid has without growing the hybrid. So like try and hold on to some of those advantages but dehybridize it and make an open pollinated seed that no one is necessarily profiting off of and we can all share with each other. Yeah. And like other people can have input on. Like I like the idea of seeds being a collaborative project. You know, like maybe we grow it for a few years here and then we pass it to someone else and they grow it a few years there, and it kind of has more regional adaptiveness that way. But then I feel like that's the way seeds were grown for a really long time, and I like the idea of them being grown that way.
Hundreds of years ago, every village had their own repertoire of varieties, and it varied from village to village, you know. And that was the diversity in the gene pool that modern breeders hundreds of years ago had to work with when they started doing things. If every grower has got this one little thing that they just like it and they keep it going, and they're not trying to make money off the seed saving process, they just like growing this thing. That's what we need, you know. There's lots and lots of little people, because who knows, maybe, you know, one day there'll be some genes in this thing that has nothing to do with anything I'm interested in, but they happen to just link and coexist with what I've got, and they could come in handy for somebody breeding a tiny little butternut. So I like the idea of just keeping keeping it going.
We often hear seed savers express a kind of nostalgia for the past, when agriculture was different and seed companies didn't really exist and all farmers were seed savers within local networks. We will never go back to those times, but we can nonetheless seek to recreate some aspects of those older seed systems and to remind ourselves that to grow food and to save seed is to be embedded in a diverse community of farmers and plants alike.
Seeds are communal in my culture. That connection, the relations are very important for me. The relations between me and the seed, because that's whatever we do. I mean, here we are having this conversation. Whatever we do, I think we affect each other, and we contribute to each other, I think. So our seed work affects each other.
Farmers have been saving squash for thousands of years, and each year the plants have changed, little by little, into the forms we eat today. We affect one another, and just as the squash have changed, we've changed too. In 100 years, southeastern seed systems will not look like what they do today, just as they don't look today what they did 100 years ago. What do you want your seed systems to look like? Big thanks to our video series sponsors, and thanks to our media sponsors. This project was funded by Southern SARE.